Welcome to Men Among Kings, a retrospective on Stephen King books to film adaptation. I'm your host with the most, JJ.
I'm Phil, your resident, knowledgeable book reader.
Sometimes podcasting is better, as they say. We're going to tackle the 2019 remake of Pet Sematary. Mm-hmm. Pet Sematary being the first episode we did, the original 1980s version of it. And now we get into this. So I want to start before we even get to the plot or anything like that. Why this movie exists today. It was officially greenlit at the end of October 2017, after it becomes the highest grossing horror film of all time.
People suddenly remembered that Stephen King is an amazing storyteller.
I think every studio was looking for a Stephen King property that they could adapt at that point. Mm-hmm. It is enormous. It's huge. It makes so much money in a month that normally people write off as like it's no big deal. That it doesn't surprise me. Pet Sematary is one of the things they go back to because they have already had a hit with it. Paramount has already made a boatload of money with it once before. It stands to reason why they could do it again.
And this time update it a little bit to make the effects a little more pleasing to the eye.
Right. Yeah. Not that the effects in the other one were horrible, with the exception of that weird face moment when
they're dated.
Lewis is looking over the side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're dated, and like the Star Wars movies where it's like, oh, we could do better. You know.
I also think the look, the shoulder pads that Denise Crosby wore, and the cars, and just there's a lot of it that does not play to a 21st century audience.
Yeah.
The fact that she doesn't have a cell phone on her while she's traveling back to Maine. And so it makes sense to me that, we'll take this and we'll update it and we'll take a second stab at it.
To make it take place in current times.
So, Phil, why don't you fill us in on the plot before we get into the nitty gritty?
Well, most of it will be very familiar because it is a remake and is straight out very similar to the first time that I read through this. Lewis Creed, a doctor from Boston, Massachusetts, moved to the small town of Ludlow, Maine with his wife Rachel and their two young children, Ellie and Gage, and Ellie's cat, Church. Exploring the woods, Ellie stumbles across a funeral procession of children taking a deceased dog to a cemetery called Pet Sematary, only spelt differently. Judd Crandall, their neighbor, warns them that the woods are dangerous. At the university hospital, Lewis is left shaken after failing to save the life of Victor Pascal, a student who was fatally injured after being struck by a vehicle. He later experiences a vivid dream in which Victor Pascal leads him to the back of the cemetery and warns him not to venture beyond. Lewis awakens to find his feet and bed sheets caked in mud, suggesting that the events were more than just a nightmare. On Halloween, Church is killed by a truck. Judd takes Lewis to the Pet Sematary, then farther to an ancient burial ground to bury Church. The next day, Lewis is stunned when Church returns home alive, although he is more aggressive, violently ripping open a bird. Judd tells Lewis that the burial ground brings things back from the dead and is believed to be inhabited by a spirit known as the Wendigo. After Church attacks Gage, Lewis attempts to euthanize him. However, he decides against killing the cat and instead sets him free. During her birthday party, Ellie spots Church on the road and rushes to him, but she is killed in an accident with a large tanker truck. The family is devastated by her death, and Rachel and Gage leave to spend a few days with Rachel's parents. Judd, sensing that Lewis is planning on resurrecting Ellie, warns the grieving father that sometimes dead is better. Despite warnings from him and Pascal's spirit, Lewis's grief and guilt spur him to carry out his plan. He drugs Judd, exhumes Ellie's body, and buries her in the burial ground of the Pet Sematary as the Wendigo watches. Ellie comes back from the dead, but manifests a disturbing demeanor. At her parents' house, Rachel is frightened by visions of her dead sister Zelda, who suffered from spinal meningitis and died after falling down a dumbwaiter shaft. Gage also sees the ghost of Victor Pascal. Judd wakes up and confronts Lewis. He spots Ellie and flees to his house in horror, retrieving a pistol to kill her. However, as he is distracted by a growling Church, Ellie slices through Judd's Achilles tendon with a scalpel. She briefly takes the form of Judd's dead wife, Norma, suggesting Norma and Ellie are suffering and burning in a damned afterlife before stabbing Judd to death while Church looks on. Rachel and Gage return home and meet the undead Ellie. Rachel is horrified, and Lewis tells her about the burial ground and its purpose. Rachel is stabbed by Ellie but manages to escape to the bathroom with Gage. Lewis finds Judd's body and is able to save Gage as Ellie fatally stabs Rachel. He locks Gage in the car and hurries to Rachel, who begs him not to bury her in the pet cemetery. Ellie knocks Lewis unconscious and drags Rachel's body to the burial ground. Lewis runs for the pet cemetery. Ellie ambushes him and they engage in a frenzied fight. As Lewis prepares to decapitate Ellie with a shovel, he is impaled with a weather vane by a reanimated Rachel, and he too is buried. Along with Church, the trio sets fire to Judd's house before approaching the car where Gage sits inside. The resurrected Lewis gestures to Gage to unlock the door.
So let's get right into this. Obviously, they decided to go in a much different direction than the first Pet Sematary. The movies themselves incredibly similar up until the birthday party, and that's where it takes the massive turn.
There are a few little things. I almost feel like this is a remake of the movie. So in a way, this movie, if this movie would have come out first, we wouldn't have the comparison with the old movie.
Right.
Which is the somewhat unfortunate aspect of this, because everybody's going to compare this movie to the original. Whether it's close to the book or not, doesn't matter. Most people who have seen this movie also saw the first one, and so they knew how different it was.
Right.
And the first movie was very close to the book.
Yeah. And it's funny because stuff that they took out of the first movie for time and just story sense, they've added back into this movie, but then they've changed. You know, it's funny because they both piecemeal pieces of the book in and out that they want. For example, the Wendigo is a much bigger part of this book than it is, or in this movie, excuse me, than it was in the first one. There were sort of allusions to it in the first one, but this, it gets called out by name, and there's a book that Lewis is reading at Judd's house, where he,
sees a picture of it,
right? With the antlers, and everything.
And that's something from the book talking about the Wendigo. They don't specify in the book that the Wendigo is the spirit that inhabits the body, but it's kind of suggested a little bit that it's evil spirits and that the Wendigo is something in the woods.
The deadfall in this movie, the barrier beyond that protects the pet cemetery from what is beyond it, was much more terrifying in this one. I thought.
And you get the sense that this burial ground in this movie, comparing to the other one, it feels like there's a more understandable reason why nobody goes there. It looks like it is surrounded by swampland and is just extremely hard to get to, and a giant deadfall, and you can't get around it.
Yeah, it's just it's in the middle of a forest. It's a pretty intense climb up. So a couple of things that hit me right off the bat is, full disclosure, I'm not a huge fan of Jason Clarke.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, God, will they ever cast Lewis with a good actor who can really take this part on?
See, and I didn't mind Jason Clarke in this role, but I'm also comparing it to the original cast of Lewis.
Right.
And his performance was so cringeworthy that it's like, oh, okay. I saw him in the role.
Did you?
I did.
I didn't. But there you go. Okay. There's our first disagreement on this one, Phil.
Yep.
I was over the moon when I found out John Lithgow was going to be playing Judd.
Me too.
And I think that he does a good job with Judd. But again, it's hard not to compare it to the original because I think Fred Gwynne did the best. Like, that is what that character is to me.
Yeah.
Up there on that rod.
And John Lithgow has no accent whatsoever.
No, and I think that was a strong choice. Yeah. I also want to call this out. They did a good job with his makeup, because one of the aspects they did is he's got this white beard. It's not a big craggly beard, but it's, it's enough facial hair there that you can tell he's a smoker because he's got that yellow tint.
Nicotine.
Yeah, on the top and the bottom. And I noticed that, and I thought, well, that's a telltale sign of somebody who is not caring for themselves for another person, right? Yeah. So that's a clear indicator that his wife is gone. The fact that he sits out by that fire and falls asleep by it, and you can tell that that's kind of a regular occurrence for him.
They did make a very different character choice with Judd, though, because in the original, he's a friendly neighbor, and in this one, he's a crotchety old man who is like, has a heart of stone, and Ellie, the daughter, breaks through that stone and he becomes more friendly. He's introduced to the family as like, hey, don't mess with me. I'm an old man and leave me alone.
Which is one of the reasons I think that's one of the reasons they changed from Gage being hit to Ellie being hit.
Oh,
because
definitely.
If they have created this emotional connection between Ellie and Judd, the fact that Ellie dies, it's almost like Judd's losing a daughter as well in this situation.
It gives you more purpose to why Judd would bring Lewis to the burial ground to resurrect Church.
Another thing is, the first movie and the book took a lot of heat from the Micmac Indian tribe, and they're named in both the movie and the book. They took away the name of the tribe in this to just kind of keep it as Native American lore, nothing specific to a group, anything like that.
Is there a real Micmac Indian?
I believe there is, yeah. In fact, I remember reading about how when the first movie came out, they were very disappointed in the way that their culture was put out there. But I think that is, another part that's really interesting. They really hit on Judd's wife, which in the first conversation that we had about this, Judd's wife plays into the book so much more. Oh, yeah. So the fact that they've got
she's
this
alive
right
in the book and not in the movie. And in this, she isn't alive in this adaptation, but she is a presence in the movie. Whereas in the first, for all you knew, Judd was single all of his life.
I felt like the character of Rachel felt fuller in this, for sure. in this movie. I felt like rather than just saying, well, we're going to need her for the last act, they give her a purpose.
Who's the actress for?
Who plays?
The new Rachel.
The new Rachel is played by Amy Seimetz. Seimetz, one or the other.
I think she does a great job with Rachel.
I think so too. I think in this movie I cared more about Rachel, and they give her a line at the end that it's the thing that sticks out to me more. Can you guess what it is, like, by any chance?
Don't bury me in that
place.
Yeah.
Where the character who is the least open about death is the one who
is accepting it more.
Who understands it the most.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting.
Lewis has got all the clinical knowledge you could ever want, but she's the one that understands that there is an earthly time, and she does not want to be a part of whatever this sickening evil is. She also spends more time, with her undead child than we saw in the first movie. She knows immediately that this thing is weird, but she sees the evil.
Yeah. In the original and in the book, it's just boom, she sees and is then attacked. Whereas in this new one, she sees, gets a hug, and knows that there's wrong, and then gets an explanation from Lewis.
Yep.
Which that never happens in the book or in the movie.
Right.
To touch back on Judd just a little bit, in a way, like the change of his demeanor in this movie works for me, because when the original movie was made in the 80s, you see the older generation just as friendly as back in those days. Whereas I feel nowadays, not that this older generation is unfriendly, but I feel like a lot more people the age of Judd is more untrusting than the previous generation.
Sure.
And legitimately, with the amount of time that passed, it's a new generation that is that age.
I also think Judd has more understanding of what's beyond that house.
Yeah.
That I really like. And this is going to sound weird too, but in the first movie, the highway runs alongside the house, and then the Pet Sematary actually runs alongside the highway, more or less.
You
walk down like in an east, like a westernly direction. So if you're driving along that highway, you can actually see the entrance to the Pet Sematary.
Yeah.
In this movie, it's behind their house,
Yeah,
so you would never know from the front of the house.
The only reason why Ellie finds it is because she's following kids.
Right. She's following kids, and I'm going to call a little bit of BS on this one. And I know this is a movie about resurrection.
Yeah.
But there is no way those kids maintain papier-mâché masks that good, that look like these animals, and walk along with just a snare drum.
It's very unbelievable. And yet, as a portion of the movie, it gives you a creepy feeling too.
It's very terrifying.
Yeah.
But I also think they could have done it just with kids walking out there not talking.
Yeah.
There's something about kids burying their own pet that has an off-putting feel to it. It's very, it's burying something is a very adult thing, I feel like. Understanding that, this thing goes into the ground and it's a final goodbye. But knowing that kids have learned that, it's entirely
and that
different.
they know that much about death,
right,
is kind of off-putting.
So Church the cat in this, thanks to special effects as well as physical effects, I think is way creepier.
Oh yeah,
this is the creepiest version of
like
an
the
undead
makeup
animal
job
I've ever seen.
On
the hair looks all matted. The eyes are super red. They're not going for just jump scares with Church. They're going for this feeling of disgust.
Yeah.
And the fact, there's that scene where Ellie puts Church outside of her room.
Mm-hmm.
So Church wants to stay with Ellie a lot.
Yeah.
It's Ellie's pet, even though it's Creed's cat now.
Yeah.
It's Lewis's cat
But they
now.
don't mention that in this. Same thing with the guy that was buried out there in the book and in the original movie. There's no reference to, at most, there is a couple like newspaper clippings that Lewis goes through where it's like, hey, a bull goes crazy, but nothing about the person that was buried out there, and that's why Judd knows not to bury humans out there. It does take a cue from the original movie where the animals come back and they're violent. But Judd mentions, I thought maybe it would be different for Ellie's cat because Ellie was friendly, whereas my dog Spot, when I buried him, he already had a mean streak to him.
Right.
And so I just thought that was...
Biffer in this movie is
Biffer,
the name of the dog. Biffer.
Yep.
But no, I think it's interesting.
So it gives you a little bit a better idea of why maybe he would have been okay with burying the cat.
And, the idea that this, instead of a World War II vet, it's a Vietnam vet that they bury out there. And the fact that, he had been war hardened. And so in this, I get the feeling that Judd has a respect for what it is out there. Mm-hmm. In the idea that I respect gasoline, right? I'm not going to play around with gasoline because I know how powerful it is. But in the first movie, Judd had a fear of that place.
Mm-hmm. He knew better.
He knew better. It was a big deal for him to go out there that first time with Lewis, and he immediately knew that he had made a mistake.
Whereas in this one, he kind of knew better, but he still had a good reasoning to be able to talk himself out of it. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the book and in the first one, he definitely knew better. But once again, in the book, not to get too far ahead in the book, but when we already had kind of had the discussion on the book. In the book, the animals, yeah, they would come back, but they would not necessarily be violent.
Right. Did you notice how both the cat and Ellie had this weird, like, half eye closed thing when they came back? Which I thought was a creepy detail to include in there that really meant, like, to me, it's like the look is off, both for them and for us. And to have a child that has a speech ability, and when Ellie starts questioning what she is, and like asking her dad.
And that's what was great about that in comparison to, along with the book, the guy who comes back, his name is escaping my head in the moment, but
Bateman, right? Tommy. Is it Bateman?
I don't think it was Bateman.
It's something like that.
Yeah. Anyway, he comes back and he isn't necessarily violent. He's just wrong. And everybody knows it. And Ellie comes back and she is just wrong. And you can sense that. And it's not that she becomes a violent fiend, but she isn't immediately a violent fiend. She's just wrong.
Right.
Timmy
Bateman. Yeah, there you go.
Timmy Baterman. There you go.
See, it just took us a little bit to get there. Okay, so here's some things that I took away from this movie right off the bat. I thought the score was only all right. I think getting a modern horror score is difficult.
Something that grabs you very strongly.
And I think one of the things that they could have improved on in this that they didn't have in the first one was the relationship between Pascal and Lewis.
It was even more.
It was even less. There was even less of a connection.
Yeah.
And I find that to be the thing, like, why couldn't he have shown him just a little bit of kindness, maybe in class? Like, Pascal comes up and says, "Oh, I didn't study for this test." He was like, "Well, okay, well, we'll figure something out and we'll go from that." Yeah. And so that when he comes in, Lewis tries to save his life, but this guy can say, like, "You tried to save me, your kindness." That's something I think they could have included and improved on. I also don't think we needed the character of Zelda anymore.
Yeah. I think they really almost did away with her anyway.
Right. In this idea that there's a dumbwaiter and Rachel doesn't want to bring she's not supposed to use the dumbwaiter to put the food in and send it up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I just think, Zelda falls down the dumbwaiter, so then the medicine cabinet becomes, the door to the dumbwaiter.
I feel like it's more kind of horrifying the way that it was originally done, where it's like she chokes to death because of Rachel, essentially, whereas she was forced to do it. And in this, it didn't. Yeah, she experienced death at a young age, and a horrifying death at that. But it just didn't seem as crucial
to me. The thing that should have been a part of this is like, so watching somebody die is terrifying. In this, she was already afraid of Zelda before Zelda even died. In fact, she kind of rejoices in Zelda's death a little bit because now she doesn't have to
in the original,
deal with it. So if I'm doing this, I would have made it something like she has to sit with her grandmother, and her grandmother's dying. Everyone comes to the hospital to say their last respects, and maybe they go outside to talk or to grab a sandwich, and Ellie's there with her grandmother, and she watches her grandmother be afraid to die, like taking those last breaths, like looking over at her and seeing the fear in her eyes. Yeah. That to me inspires fear into death, right? Because you're watching somebody as a child, you look to your parents and your grandparents as like people who have it together, and they're the ones who care for you. And when they show fear, it doubles inside of a child, because now your parents come in to check your room for the boogeyman, right? Yeah. Well, what if your parents came in and they were afraid of the boogeyman? Now there's nobody left to take that fear away.
I feel like Zelda's death in this was more of hey, let's do a scary visual.
It reminded me of that scene from It where they open the refrigerator.
Oh, yeah, and then he climbs out. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I felt like from this, was when you see the twisted body around. Also, falling down, here's what I didn't understand. So she sent this up. Is the dumbwaiter on the ground for Zelda? I mean, you'd have to crawl into the dumbwaiter to fall down it.
And, yeah, for sure, because otherwise, I mean... Yeah, she's got spinal meningitis, so obviously she's not quite right. But why would she crawl into the dumbwaiter to get the food?
Right.
The dumbwaiter isn't that huge.
Right.
Yeah, it just seemed weird.
It also reminded me that, like, it took me out of the movie because Webster, in the show Webster, had a dumbwaiter, and he used to use it to ride up and down, like, the stairs. And I thought of that immediately, and I was like, oh, is Webster going to come out of there?
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see.
It was a creepy visual. In the same vein, even though he was very underutilized, the visuals with Pascal, I mean, you could tell that we've made some advances in technology and visual effects and everything like that. The one thing that I definitely liked, that was a really cool thing about this, was when Pascal takes Louis to the Pet Sematary to warn him about it. It's not, hey, let's go for a walk through the woods and just keep following me through this long path. It's he opens a door and boom, you're there. It's like you're magically whisked away, which leads you more into believing, or which leads Louis anyway more into believing that this is a dream. You don't just open your door and you're in a pet cemetery. So there were some cool improvements in some of that, but
do you think that this movie is really the first in setting up the Stephen King shared universe of films? And I'll give you two examples right off the bat. When Rachel is driving back to Ludlow, Maine, she passes a sign for dairy, saying dairy 20 miles. At the birthday party, you can overhear Judd telling a story about a dog from the town over that, went crazy. I think he specifically says a big Saint Bernard got rabies. There are little things that just kind of wink at other Stephen King properties throughout this.
Well, and that's what's interesting, is that in a good pile of Stephen King books is that it is a shared universe. I don't think we'll ever get any kind of crossover in any films, but I could see them continuing doing like a little smile and a wink and a nod to people who know Stephen King. In fact, because of the success of it and potentially the success of this new version of Pet Sematary, because it did well, right?
It did. It cost $21 million to make, grossed over 100. In fact, let's see. It grossed 112 million worldwide. Yeah. So I mean, it made money. Sure. It made plenty of money.
I have no doubt that they're going to continue making more and more Stephen King adaptations from his older works and just modernize them. I could see a Christine coming out, a new Cujo. The Dead Zone was done in a TV series, but that was over a decade old now.
So, an interesting tidbit is they've talked about instead of a sequel to Pet Sematary, a prequel to it.
Ooh.
Yeah. And so there was talk slightly after the movie came out, and the stuff that happens before the Creed family moves in, so essentially leading up to the events of the Creeds coming to Ludlow.
Maybe seeing Judd as a young man.
Right. Or, finding out, I mean, they could do a whole movie even like set back in the 1800s.
Oh, yeah.
About this, like when this area is being, first settled specifically. I don't know if I like that idea. Part of me says...
It's easily doable, but...
Yeah, they spend plenty of time in this movie talking about where this power came from, that if we see something, we're just going to watch where the power came from again.
Frankly, I don't want to know where the power came from.
Right.
It's there. There's something off-putting about just the presence of evil. You don't need to know where it came from, which is what I feel like a lot of movies or, take, for example, the Paranormal Activity movies. I loved the first Paranormal Activity. I know not everybody did, but I loved it. And it was evil because... there is evil. in the sequels, they start to try to explain, well, where did that evil come from? Why did it come about? And it just became hokey to me.
Yeah. And
I don't need to know why something is evil to know that it is evil. It's almost scarier to know that it's there and that it doesn't matter where it came from. It is there.
As this movie ends, the climax of this, the fight where I also feel like there's a little nod to The Shining here when Ellie's like, slashing her way into the bathroom to get her mom. I feel like that line that I was talking about, like, don't bury me in that place, was very powerful. I mean, it stays with me. Even like right now, thinking about like, that's the line I took away from this movie. And when she comes back, when you find out that the daughter buried the mother there, so now the mother is technically in control of the daughter.
Not to interrupt you there, but that is one thing that pulled me out a little bit. I'm like, how did that little girl haul that big body all the way up there?
Nope, I agree. And in fact, that's the second time in the movie where I had to ask myself that question, because when they buried that bull that he's reading the story about, like essentially zombie bull roams, the streets of Ludlow. How do you carry a bull all the way up to this place? Like, getting it over the deadfall would be amazing.
And that's something in the book that is kind of mentioned, is that Judd mentions somebody buried a bull up there, and it's just, how the hell did he do it? They don't say how, but somebody had the ability and audacity to bury their damn bull up there.
I get the feeling that the supernatural power of the Wendigo gives you strength that you didn't know you had.
That could be.
And that the Wendigo wants this evil to take place so much that you get some strength.
Yeah.
And because at one point, like, is it Lewis wakes up while he's being drugged?
Yeah.
Right? Like, and you only see her, right? Dragging, or is it the mom with
Ellie?
Her too? Yeah. And so
you don't know that. I mean, you know that she's likely been buried out there, but you don't expect her to stab Lewis in the back.
This is a movie that does not have a happy ending, which is similar to the first Pet Sematary movie.
But this one has an almost more dreadful ending.
The visual of that baby, that little tiny toddler in this car, and then hearing the boop boop of the car, the keys, because these aren't mindless zombies.
No,
these talk, they think, they can reason. And so, it's not like they're going and just like slapping at the windows. They know how to unlock a car. They know where the keys are. They know how to unlock a car. And
you know that they're going to kill Gage
and bury Gage.
Him up there.
I think that what would be great is, so let's say we started a Stephen King shared universe, like, set of films, right? Even though I know that, I mean, it is over at Warner Brothers. This is a Paramount release. I mean, that's the thing is, Stephen King's properties are all over the place. But
you could still, like, point out things. Like, there's you can't not say dairy. Like, you can't say Wolverine in MCU stuff.
But I would love in one of the movies a nod to the fact that, like, that family that went on a murdering streak and were all gunned down or something like that. Because you want to know what happens to this family. Yeah. You want to know what happens to this undead family. And also the fact that the end of the movie takes place in the light of day is terrifying. The sequence with the blood on the porch is shocking to me.
Yeah.
Because they really, like, the movie opens.
It opens with like, that.
Yeah. With
crap went down.
Right. Essentially, it opens with one of the last shots of the movie with like this blood on the porch, and the house, the door is wide open, and so I feel like people were A, surprised by Ellie, B, surprised at the very beginning showing tipping its hat. But that's what's nice when you do like a secondary remake of another film, right? You sort of fake everyone out. And they did a good job faking us out. But you also get free range to change the things that you want to change.
Yeah. It's one of those things similar to the It remake where, yeah, they made changes, but I felt like those changes were appropriate. Mm-hmm. They worked. And even Stephen King had said that it was a horrifying movie and they did a fantastic job.
So, Phil, as we wrap this up, I'm going to ask you to review this movie 2 times.
Okay.
I want you to review it as if you had never seen the original Pet Sematary.
Okay.
And then I want you to review it as original compared to remake.
I'm gonna once again kind of, as I tend to do, compare to book.
Yep.
So for this new version, ignoring the fact that there is an old version, it takes liberties with the book. You know, nothing. It's not a faithful adaptation. Judd isn't friendly right away, but they do have some interesting aspects of. They mentioned that he had a wife. In fact, that scene when Ellie kind of becomes the wife for a brief moment to taunt Judd, that happens in the book. So there's definitely certain things about the movie that comes right from the book, but a lot of the changes come about because of the time update too. You know, there's a lot of things that have changed in the last 30 years since the book was written. So faithfulness to the book, strong enough that it works very well. And I think this is definitely, you gotta definitely watch it. Comparing to the original one is closer to the book, but there were aspects of that first one that are just so cringeworthy. Whereas in this new one, I didn't cringe about acting. I didn't cringe about just weird visuals or anything like that, other than just out of fright. So when you compare it to the 80s version, I think it's better than the 80s version. Comparing it to on its own and to the book, not as strong, but still really good. So I think I review it better because of what the original one was.
Okay. If I had never seen the first one, or if the first one didn't exist, and going into this, I think of it as a fine horror movie that I'm not intending to really see again. Mm-hmm. So if I am flipping through the channels at 1 o'clock in the morning and it's on, I'm not going to be disappointed if I only catch it halfway through. But I did not feel a desire to continue watching it because they take a more realistic approach to a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
For example, when he's brushing Ellie's hair, it's terrifying to see the staples in her head, mm-hmm. but it doesn't really give me an ominous feeling. So I think it's a fine horror movie for what it is. I'm not going to own it on DVD anytime soon, but I didn't dislike it.
Yeah.
I didn't leave the movie theater going, ugh, it's another dream catcher. Comparing the original version, the 89 version, to this, I prefer the 89 version, even with the lackluster special effects from the time, because the whole movie feels dark and it feels like there's constantly a cloud hanging over. And the one moment there's happiness, it's ripped away in that feeling. So to me, I prefer that other one. And it could be I watched that when I was a kid, and so I've got a nostalgia, mm-hmm. Aspect that's kind of creeping in on me there. But the shots that they take, like when they're on the phone and they're talking to each other and they're showing the enormity of, like from the ground looking all the way up at Rachel while she's on the phone, and these little aspects, I enjoyed those more. I also like the fact in the original that the truck driver is just kind of bebopping along and listening to the Ramones, and the accident was unavoidable. Like that was just sort of going to happen. Versus in this, it's maybe a commentary on distracted driving because the guy reaches over for his cell phone. Instead of just coming around a blind curve. And the accident in this one was so much more horrific with like the tanker, like essentially the tanker smearing Ellie across the pavement rather than just getting hit by the truck. That's a situation where I'm like, you don't need to show me the horror of this. We understand how horrific this would be, and almost things not being shown would make it a little more terrifying for me. That being said, they played with visuals like the cat, which we mentioned, that really gave me the heebie-jeebies whenever that cat was just sitting there staring at somebody. But I think I'd watch the original before I watched this again.
Once again, the original was closer to the book and had certain aspects about the book that were not necessarily explained in the movie, but were kind of hinted at and there, like the parental relationship with Rachel and her parents, not good. And
the Lewis's descent into madness, more or less, I think is done better in the 1989 version than it is here. I think this one where it misses the mark is, and we've changed a lot since this book was written. And I mean, Stephen King, this is a personal experience that he had that he put into a book form of like, what would it be like if this road that I live by claimed, the life of one of my kids? I feel like we deal with death differently today. We are asking more questions of each other, and there's more things that, are pieces of therapy. I find it hard to believe that in the modern version of this, Rachel would take off with their baby and leave Lewis behind.
Also, with satellite photography, people would see that there's something weird going on.
Even a drone, right?
It'd be harder to hide stuff.
Right. And so I feel like the 80s was the last vestige of being able to do something like that without it. And so hindsight's 2020. I maybe would have said set this movie back in the 80s again, have this movie take place in 85, especially because Chapter 1 was so successful because I feel like it was set in the 80s and it was kids. But this movie shows some stuff that's really dark.
Yeah.
It also, by the way, was primed. It came out 2 weeks before Easter?
March 16th.
And so I feel like,
April 5th.
They were really playing off the fact that it's Easter, it's the resurrection, and I'm like, oh boy, you guys really went for it there, huh? But I will give this a medium. If you like Stephen King stuff, you'll definitely get something out of this.
Oh yeah.
In fact, a lot of this movie is made to wink and nod at the Stephen King fans. If you're a general moviegoer and you didn't see this in theaters, I don't see you making a big leap to go and get it. It's not going to play every year on Halloween. Yeah.
If you hadn't read the book and hadn't seen the original movie, it's a movie. It's a horror movie. Has some good scares. It's enjoyable.
All right. Well, Pet Sematary, the 2019 remake of it. I think we're ready to put this one to bed.
What do you say? Thumbs up? Go see it?
I say if someone brings it to your house to watch, you might as well. I wouldn't say go out and seek it.
Yeah?
Yeah, unless you're a Stephen King fan. But if you are, you've already watched this movie.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think of my sister in this case, right? A casual moviegoer, has seen quite a lot of stuff over the years, but I don't remember her going out to see it in the theaters, and I don't remember her grabbing it from the Red Box.
Yeah.
So
if I remember right, I think out of 10, I gave the original a 7. I would maybe give this 6.5. Just maybe a touch under, but
it's no 1.2 that Pet Sematary 2 was.
I mean, you could have either or works. Just know that they do have some inherent differences,
right?
But they work.
You'll never beat Fred Gwynn for me though. That's the thing. Yeah. So as we decide to put this one down, Phil. Remember that the soil of man's heart is stony.
Stony.
All right. For Men Among Kings, I'm your host with the most, JJ.
I'm Phil.
We'll see you next time.